What's going on, everybody? I want to continue to track values of PSA slabbed cards to SGC slabbed cards. You know, there's been all this discussion recently about, the acquisition from the PSA parent company of SGC. And, what's going to happen with that? None of us know, right? We can all speculate. It's fun to talk about. Some people hate talking about it. But I think it's interesting to talk about, but that's not what we're going to talk about today. One of the questions that people continue to ask and talk about and think about is, when submitting cards, should you submit cards to SGC or should you submit them to PSA? And when you're buying cards, should you buy cards in PSA holders or SGC holders? Now, my advice is always going to be what I do. Like, if I wouldn't give advice to someone else if it wasn't something that I did myself, right? Well, what do I do myself? I collect both. And I even have some BGS stuff. And I don't collect based on being only PSA or SGC, even though it does drive me a little bit crazy about not having the uniformity. I collect what I think is the best deal for that card, regardless of the grade or the holder. So that's my advice. But I also think that we should continue to keep track of what's happening. If you were going to be told, if somebody told you in 5 years SGC slabs would be worth more than PSA, number one, you'd probably be surprised. And I would certainly be surprised. I am by no means expecting that. But if that was the case, you might be more inclined to buy cards that were in SGC holders than PSA holders, right? If there was some major controversy or leak or data breach or something happened at PSA that really harmed their brand. I mean, if you just go back 15 years, maybe even less than that, Beckett was actually, in a lot of people's eyes, ranked a little bit above PSA. And now Beckett is a distant third. So anything can happen and could happen. But I'm not suggesting that anything will happen. All I'm suggesting is we should continue to track both companies. We should be buying the card, not the grade or the holder. But if there is a premium of one over another, if there's a discount of one over the other, then it's something I think as collectors we should be aware of to try to get the most for our money. So what I did is I went through and I pulled a bunch of data. Now, I used to pull all of the data by hand. And then I recently got access to Market Movers. And in Market Movers, it allows me to pull that data a lot easier because they've already got the data. I just got to tell it what data I want. So what I did is I wanted to take a snapshot. And again, that's all this is a snapshot. There's going to be people that are going to say, oh, this data doesn't mean anything, Greg, because this data is not comprehensive enough. Sure. I mean, and if you want to be fair, the S&P 500 doesn't track the entire stock market, nor does the Dow Jones. It just tracks little snapshots within the stock market. So you could say that about any tracking method, that nothing is fully comprehensive. We just have to select certain data that help us get an idea of what's happening. And that's all this is. That's all I did today. Is I chose a handful of cards from the mid to late 1950s at a variety of grades. And I did not choose the 9s and the 10s, and I didn't choose the authentics and the 1s, because I wanted to choose grades that there are a high number of transactions. See, when there are lots of transactions and lots of data points and lots of sales, it averages out the data much better. If there are 3 sales, one could be wild. For some reason, one could be really high or really low, and it throws off all the data. But if you have 25 data points, one really high or really low one kind of works itself out. So I pulled the data. We're going to look at it together. To me, this is a video that's more about visual representation. So this is a video where instead of me just talking, I do more showing. And so I'm going to switch things around here in a second, and I'm going to get on my computer and I'm going to show you the data points. I'm going to show you the trend lines. I'm going to show you the averages and the charts from market movers. And in that, you're going to be able to see better than here, but be able to see what's happening. And I'm telling you, there were some things that surprised me. I say this every time I pull data. Every time I pull data, I say I might do all this work and I might find nothing. I might find nothing of relevance, which in itself is actually finding something. Because if you find nothing surprising, that actually tells you something. It tells you that nothing has changed or nothing is different than what you expected, which is actually telling you something. In this case, I found something that surprised me. And I think that you might find it surprising as well. In the video that I posted on Sunday is a discussion with myself and Theo from Clemente Collector and Billy Ballgame. And in that video, we talk a little bit about this data, which I'm about to go through with you. And I think that it's interesting. And whether you are a person who buys graded cards or a person who doesn't, whether you love SGC or hate SGC or love PSA or hate PSA, or you're all only raw cards, I feel like information like this affects all of us. So let's take a look at the data that I pulled and some of the conclusions that I came up with.
All right, so here I am on the computer, and there's a few things that I want to share with you that I put together from some data that I collected. Now, most of this data pull was from Market Movers. I've mentioned Market Movers in the past. I think it's a great app. I've got a link for a discount if you're interested in obtaining the Market Movers app. I think you get 30% off if you use my promo code. It's in the description below. If not, no worries. I have Market Movers and I have Card Ladder. I think both are great. I think both have pros and cons. But one of the things I like as a visual person is I really like a lot of the charts that Market Movers offers. And so, I use it a lot, and I'm analyzing data with it a lot. And that's where a lot of this data that I'm about to show you came from. And then I kind of pull it apart and see if there are any sort of trends that we can find. So that's what we're going to do. So let me pull up on the screen for you. So basically, is PSA's lead shrinking? As I just talked about a second ago, one of the main benefits of PSA is the fact that PSA cards tend to sell for more. So keeping tabs on whether that continues is kind of important because it's one of the main things that PSA has as an advantage over SGC. So let's go ahead and start looking at some of this data. So what I have here is I have the 1959 Bob Gibson, right? And you can see two Bob Gibsons over here on the right. So let me kind of explain what I've got here. The first one is a 59 Bob Gibson in a PSA 3 and some information. So that's the dark blue. All right, so the dark blue line that you see here, these are all of the different sale points over the last 365 days of a variety of PSA 3 Bob Gibsons, okay? And that's what this trend line is. So the dark blue trend line is sort of an average of the averages of the Bob Gibson in a PSA 3. Again, we're looking at the last 365 days here. Now, conversely, what we've got is the Bob Gibson in an SGC 3, all right? And that's the light blue line. So these are all the data points of the SGC3. And you say, well, why didn't you start with a PSA 2 and an SGC 2. There just aren't enough data points to make the data very reliable. We wanted to find points where there are lots of sales because that makes the trend lines, that makes the averages a lot more reliable. So you can then see the trend line of what's happening here with SGC3. So in this case, over the last year, the price of a PSA 3 Bob Gibson rookie has gone up a little bit. And the price of an SGC3 has gone down a little bit, right? Now, if you also look over to the right, there's some more data here. It tells you what the last sale was. So there's this one here. Who knows what happened with that particular card? It could be maybe it was way off center or something. But that's what the last sale number is. And the last sale of a PSA was higher. But there's a couple of pieces of information that we're going to focus on. The first is what is the average of the last year. Now people say, well, Greg, there are some, maybe they're all off center if they're the SGC. They're all off center if they're the PSA. It's not reliable. We're looking at quite a few data points. I mean, if we're looking at the PSA here, we're looking at probably 20, 25 different sales. So this is the average of the average. It's fairly reliable that there are some off center and some perfectly centered. It just kind of, that's the point of an average, is to get the average, right? Now, if we look at the PSA, the average PSA, SGC3 down here, over the last year is $408. Now, that was pulled down a little bit from this one, but it was pulled up from some of the higher ones. So again, this is the average. So the average of the PSA continues to be a little bit higher. So let's go ahead and now look at a PSA 4 versus an SGC 4. Actually, before we do that, let's look at what has happened with the difference in the values. So if we look back almost a year, you can see that the SGC is pretty close to the PSA's value. But if we fast forward to more recently, that price difference has changed. So in this particular case, with this particular card at this particular grade, again, this is just a snapshot, what we see is PSA's value and SGC's value has widened, meaning PSA's lead has gotten bigger with this particular card. Now, let's look at a PSA 4 versus an SGC 4. In this case, there's a couple of things, again, we want to look at. So included in that would be the averages. So the average of the 4 for PSA over the last year. So that's every card over the last year that is sold in a PSA 4 that has been recorded from an auction site is $565. But the SGC is $551. So this is a much closer gap between the two. Now, PSA is still a little ahead, but if we look at the trend line here, when we started the year, SGC was a little bit behind PSA, right? The light blue line is a little below the dark blue trend line. But when the year ended, the SGC is a little above the PSA. So that's interesting. So the averages are fairly close, but the trend line here shows SGC going from a little behind to a little above, a little ahead. So let's see what happens when we look at the 5s. So in the 5s, again, let's first look at the averages. In this case, the averages for the 5s. The PSA averaged over the course of the year $729, and the SGC $759. And you say, well, there are some really nice ones. Yeah, they sold for a lot. And there are some not so nice ones. They sold for less. Again, these are averages. And then we have the SGC. Look at this one on SGC. This one sold for quite a bit. So again, this is the data pulled from the Market Mover site. And their trend lines are the averages of the averages for each time period. So you can see how it has changed over the course of the year. So in this case, the average for the SGC is a little ahead. And the trend line has gone from a little bit behind for SGC to a little ahead for SGC. All right, now how about for the 6? Now in the 6, again, the averages in this case are now the same. And if you look at the last sale for the SGC is higher than the last sale for the PSA. Now, maybe it's a nicer card. Sure. But when we look at the start of the year, they were literally the same. The trend lines, the average of the average at the beginning of the year were pretty darn close. The lines are pretty much on top of each other. But by the end of the year, the SGC trend line is a little bit ahead. So the averages are the same, but it's trending towards SGC in the 6th grades. So if we look here at this information, I think this is where it gets super interesting. So what I did is I put on a chart. I compared the 59 Bob Gibson in a PSA 3 versus an SGC 3, and you can see that the PSA 3 is a little ahead. In fact, I even found the percentage ahead. It's 19.85% ahead for PSA over SGC for the average over the last year. In the 4, it's interesting that PSA is ahead, but not ahead by much. And then in the 5, SGC is ahead, and then in the 6, they're the same, right? Now, if we look at this next piece of information, this is where it gets interesting, I think. And that's what is happening with the trend line. So in the 3, the PSA's lead is growing. But in the SGC passed PSA in the 4. SGC went from neutral to ahead in the 5. And in the 6, SGC has a lead that is increasing. So the PSA value is ahead in 2 of the 4 grades here, but SGC has made gains in 3 of the 4 grades. So this is just the Bob Gibson, though. So then you say, well, what about other years? What about other cards? Okay, let's look at the 58 Willie Mays. So the 58 Willie Mays in a PSA 3 versus an SGC 3, right? If we look at the averages over the last year, PSA is an average of $3 higher. And there's one that sold for really high up here. Not sure what happened. Maybe it's a really, really nice one. So that pulled up the average a little bit. You can see the last sale. The last sale of the SGC is $150. The last sale of the PSA is $142. But again, if we look at the trend, PSA was barely ahead when the year started. And now SGC is barely ahead. It's almost even. But it does appear from the trend lines provided by market movers that it has made a little bit of progress. The SGC has gone from a little behind to a little ahead. So how about the 4 grade? Well, in the 4 grade, what we've got is an average of 210 versus 206. Again, very similar. PSA a little ahead again. But again, if we look at the trend line of SGC started behind, now is ahead. PSA was ahead. PSA is now behind, according to the trend line in this particular grade. So it's interesting that it seems like so far that SGC values are trending upward more than PSA values are trending upward. But this is just, a couple of cards. So now we got one where we've got the PSA values at 356, the SGC values at 286. Quite a big lead for PSA. And then you can see that the PSA has trended a little bit upward and the SGC has trended a little bit downward. So in this grade, a little bit of a higher grade, a mid grade, but higher than the 3 and the 4, PSA is expanding its lead. How about in a PSA versus SGC 6. Now in this one, you can see again the averages, 660. It's interesting. Isn't that how many home runs? I think that's how many home runs he had. Versus SGC 660 versus 513. That's quite a lead in the average for PSA over SGC. And if we look at the trend line, pretty similar. It looks like PSA has gone down a little and SGC has gone down a little bit more, but fairly parallel. Interesting. This is a big sale. It's just interesting. And this is a low sale. So obviously each card tells part of the story, but the averages is why we focus on that. So now, in every single case, the PSA average over the last year is higher than the SGC average over the last year. In the 3, it's a $3 advantage for PSA. In the 4, it's a $4 advantage for PSA. So close, but then it's a big jump here, right? $70 advantage for PSA in the 5s, which equates to almost 25%. And then 660 to 513, which equates to about 28%. So in every single case here, PSA has the lead. And in the higher grades, it's a higher increase. That's kind of what historically we had seen. And then if we look at the trend lines, of the 3, PSA did better than SGC for the Willie Mays cards, for the 58 Willie Mays. SGC did better than PSA at one of the grades. Again, when you take a snapshot, you never know what you're going to find, but the more that you add to it, the more you start to see some trends. So let's keep going now to the 57. Now the 57 card that I chose was the Frank Robinson. Now, why did I choose kind of popular cards? Why did I choose the Bob Gibson and the Willie Mays and the Frank Robinson? The reason I chose more popular cards, more well-known cards, is because those are the cards that sell more frequently. And the more frequently that they sell, the more data points we have. Okay, so if you see, look at all of these PSA sales of Frank Robinsons. Look at all of these SGC sales of Frank Robinsons. Because there were so many sales, it makes the data that much more reliable. So if we look here, 210 for the PSA, 191 for the SGC in the 3 grade. So a $19 advantage for PSA. So again, PSA continues to have higher value for the 365-day average. And in this case, they were fairly close at the start of the year. And then PSA was trending slightly upward, SGC slightly downward, which equates to SGC's value is not keeping up with PSA's, and PSA's lead is growing with this card at this grade. So let's keep moving. So now we've got the PSA 4 versus SGC for the same card. Now, when this year started, the SGC was a little ahead. And now the SGC is behind. So for the second consecutive grade of this card, the 365-day average is better for the 4 PSA. And the trend is trending better. The PSA is trending slightly up. The SGC is trending down. So that's interesting. Now, again, I'm going to provide summaries of each card, and then I'll also be providing summaries of the summaries, and we'll see what kind of data we can get from that. So in this one, now we're at the PSA versus SGC 5. What we've got is 414, right? 414 here for the PSA 5 is the 1-year average. And the 1-year average of the SGC 5 is 349. And if you look, both have trended slightly upwards. In fact, very, very similar trending upwards. I would say neither has gained. It seems kind of neutral. PSA's lead has stayed about the same. And then the last grade, again, why am I not doing a PSA 7, 8, and 9? Because there are hardly any sales over the course of the year, which means the data is not very reliable. We want as many data points as possible. So we've got the PSA 6 versus the SGC 6. Again, PSA leads. Both are down slightly. It looks to me like the difference is maybe a little bit more. Like PSA went down a little bit less than SGC went down in the 6th grade. Pretty similar. But it does look to me like the difference between where the year started and where the year is now on the averages and trend lines is a little bit to the benefit of PSA. So let's look. So again, in every single case, the PSA card sold for more, about 10% more in the 3, 8% more in the 4, almost 19% in the 5, and about 15% in the 6. Again, we continue to see PSA have the lead. And in 2 of the leads, it seems like their lead grew a little bit. And then in 2 of them, it seemed pretty neutral. So again, this is just one card, 4 grades over the course of 1 year. But we're going to do a few more cards here to try to get a bigger picture look at what's happening across multiple years, multiple cards, multiple different grades. So here we go. In this case, we got the 56 Jackie Robinson is what I chose. And we'll start with the 3 again. A lot of data points here. And when I look at it, for the average, 443 for the 3 for PSA, 420 for the 3 for SGC. And if we look at the trend lines, there's a little bit of a lead for PSA at the start of the year. And at the very end of the year, it's pretty much the same. So I would say pretty similar SGC, probably up a tick or so. And then we'll go to the 4 grade. In the 4 grade, the 1-year average for PSA is 584. And the 1-year average for SGC is 538. But look at the difference at the start of the year. PSA had a clear lead. And at the end of the year, if anything, it looks like SGC might be slightly ahead. So that means the averages for SGC at the end of the year are a little bit better than the averages at the beginning of the year. And PSA's averages at the beginning of the year are better than the averages at the end of the year. So it looks to me like SGC is trending better than PSA in the 4 grade. So how about in the 5? In the 5, we've got 773 versus 658. So the grade for a 5, again, an advantage, a clear advantage. Look at this one. This is an outlier. There may be more to the story on that one, but again, it's the average of the averages. So it kind of washes out. And in this case, the average is clearly better for PSA once again. And if we look at the gap between the 2 at the start of the year versus the end of the year, it looks again like SGC is slightly closing the gap. It's slightly closer at the end of the year than it was at the beginning. There's no doubting that PSA is still selling for more, but the amount more is less than it was when you started. Now, if we look at the PSA 6, look at this. This is interesting. Both are clearly going up in value for the Jackie Robinson over the last 365 days at the 6th grade. And price-wise, we got $1,100 versus $962. So again, a lead for PSA. But it does look to me like if we look at the trend line, most of these Jackies are higher, and a lot of the PSAs are lower. So it does look like SGC once again is closing the gap. So let's look at the comparison. Again, not to be surprised. The 3, the 4, the 5, and the 6, in all cases, PSA has a lead. And it's not surprising that the lead is a little bit bigger in the higher grades. That's kind of been the trend we're seeing. But then if we look at where are things trending, in 3 of the 4 cases, SGC did better than PSA over the course of the year. So what does that actually mean? That means that the SGCs, in comparison to the PSAs, are selling for a closer amount at the end of the year than the start of the year, which means SGC values are trending better than PSA values. We got 2 more cards. This is going to be the 55 Koufax. Again, a very popular card, frequently sold. So there's lots of data points. You can see them all on here. Makes this data super valuable. And when we look, we've got 787 versus 713. Once again, PSA selling for more. If we look here, there is clearly a lead at the beginning of the year. There is clearly a lead at the end of the year. It's close, but it looks to me like SGC is a little bit closer at the end of the year than at the beginning of the year. So it looks like in the 3, SGC is making up a little bit of ground on the 3 grade. Now this one looks almost parallel. So we got $1,090 versus $1,060 for the value over the course of the year. And PSA benefited from this pretty high sale at the very end. Look pretty darn similar. I mean, the distance between what they were selling at in comparison at the beginning and in is almost identical. So I'd say there's no real benefit for either. And now if we look at the next grade, which is the 5, we got 1,800 versus 1,720 for the average. And if you look here, look at these last 2 SGCs. They're doing really well. In fact, 3 of the last 4 are doing really well. That one was pretty good. Good. And this one, low one. And there was one good one here, but then earlier in the year, the SGC was kind of low. And then at the end of the year, the SGC is pretty high. So the SGC is clearly trending upwards. Now that one throws it off a little bit. It's probably more in here, but still SGC is performing better than PSA in this particular grade. And then if we go to the 6, now this is interesting. SGC is actually selling for more on average than PSA in the 6th grade. So we got just under 3,000 and then just over 3,000 for the average. But if you look at PSA, it's a slightly upward trend, and SGC is a slightly downward trend. So PSA is done a little bit better. That last sale in SGC hurt it, but then this one's kind of along the line. You know, most of them are pretty, there's nothing crazy. This one's kind of low. This one's kind of high, but for the most part, these are pretty normal looking. So again, if we look at the values, this is an interesting chart. We got the differential 10% more for PSA 3 than SGC, a little bit more for PSA in the 4 and the 5, then a little ahead for SGC in the 6. So if we look here, pretty darn neutral in the 3 and the 4. Slight gain from SGC in the 5. That was hard to tell because of that one outlier, but it does seem like it's trending better. And then PSA is doing a little bit better in the 6. All right, one more card, and then we'll look at some overall summaries. Now in this one, and it got that 54 Kaline. It kind of went backwards. We went 59, 58, 57, 56, 55, and here we are at our last one at the 54. So we've got the Kaline in a 3. PSA is 457, and then 421 for the SGC. The beginning of the year, SGC was clearly behind, and now SGC looks like it's a little bit ahead. Look at those two of the last 4 sales for SGC were pretty darn good sales. PSA had a really good one too. But SGC is gaining in this one. And then in this one, so again, we'll look at the averages, pretty similar. 612 to 603 with a very slight lead. And as you can see over the course of the year, it looks like they have kind of trended identically. PSA maintaining its very slight lead from the beginning of the year all the way to the end of the year. So kind of no real movement from either one there. And then in the 5, again, when we get into higher grades sometimes and some cards don't sell as much, we have less data points, but we still have some stuff to work with. Now, this one was clearly affected by this really high one. This sold for about twice as much as any of the others. So don't know maybe what happened there, but the average is clearly higher for the 5 for PSA. Again, that is suspect. But even with that one, you see a slight upward trend for SGC, a little bit of a downward trend for PSA. And then the last card before we look at this summary and then the overall summary. We got $1,340 for the 6, and we've got $1,130 for the SGC 6. Again, not a ton of data points, but it does seem like there is clearly a trend upwards for the SGC. And the end of year sales are clearly less than the beginning of year sales for PSA. So PSA is trending slightly down, SGC slightly up. So once again, if we're looking at just value, the pink represents PSA again. And PSA's value across the board is still a little bit better. But we're not just focused on what is the value across the board. We're looking at where are things moving. And when we look at where they're moving, SGC is clearly gaining in the 3, and then slightly gaining in the 5 and the 6. And the 4, again, not really anything noticeable. So in this card, again, what we've seen throughout the whole thing, time and time again, the value is a little bit higher for PSA, but the trend, meaning the average at the end of the year versus the average at the beginning of the year, is showing continually, in a lot of cases, SGC is trending closer or above PSA at the end of the year versus the beginning of the year. So we want to kind of see, where are things going? And that's what the trend line teaches us where things are going. So the first thing let's look at here is, on average, if you took every card, every grade, not an average of the values, because that could be skewed by the higher value ones. But if we take an average of the averages, the PSA cards are still selling for a little over 10% more than the SGC of the equal grade. That is very common. That is what we've always thought. But when we look at the trending, the trend is showing that SGC has gained ground in 11 of the 24 examples that we looked at. PSA has gained ground in 7 of the 24. And there's been no movement in 6. So this is interesting to take a look at, and this is an interesting thing that I think that we have to really talk about. And it's something that we have to really be deliberate about, is tracking this. because if you're okay with SGC or PSA, if it doesn't really matter to you, and in a lot of cases SGC seems to be catching up in value, then it might mean that you're buying SGC at a discount. Because if that trend continues and SGC continues to catch up, then you're buying things for less now because it's clearly less. Will it always be less? Now, if you just aren't about PSA or you aren't about SGC or you're not about grading, then you should collect obviously what you prefer. But if you're looking at it from where am I getting the best value, I think that what I learned out of this is yes, PSA is clearly still selling for more, but in a lot of cases, in well over half of the examples, where there was a change, right? It was SGC that was gaining ground in values. They were closing the gap at the end of the year compared to the beginning of the year. And I think this is an important thing to monitor, and I'm going to continue to monitor it.